Montgomery stood in his command tent, maps spread across the table, his eyes scanning the lines representing Allied divisions preparing for one of the most crucial operations of World War II. When his staff officers mentioned deploying Canadian forces to close the Falaise Gap, he scoffed. Farm boys, he called them. Colonials who knew more about plowing fields than fighting wars. Men who belonged behind tractors, not tanks. It was August 1944, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was about to learn the most humbling lesson of his distinguished military career. The Falaise Pocket. Even the name sounds deceptively simple, almost pastoral. A pocket. Something small, contained, manageable. But what happened in those blood-soaked Norman fields between August 7 and August 21, 1944, would become one of the most devastating battlefield massacres in military history. And the men Montgomery dismissed as farm boys would write their names in blood and steel across the pages of warfare, creating a killing ground so horrific that hardened Wehrmacht generals would call it the corridor of death. Before we dive into the carnage, before we witness the transformation of farm boys into killing machines, we need to understand who these Canadians really were. Because Montgomery wasn't entirely wrong in his initial assessment. Many of them were indeed farm boys. Young men from Saskatchewan wheat fields, Ontario dairy farms, Quebec lumber camps and Alberta cattle ranches. They knew the weight of a plow handle better than a rifle. They understood soil composition better than military tactics. But what Montgomery failed to grasp, what would cost thousands of SS troops their lives, was that these farm boys carried something far more dangerous than military training. They carried fury. Canada had entered World War II in September 1939, 9 days after Britain. While America debated isolationism and Britain struggled to mobilize, Canadian volunteers flooded recruitment centers. They came from small towns with names like Moose Jaw and Medicine Hat, from cities like Toronto and Montreal, from fishing villages in Nova Scotia and mining communities in British Columbia. They came because their fathers had fought in the trenches of the First World War. They came because fascism was spreading across Europe like a plague. They came because it was the right thing to do. By 1944, these farm boys had been hardened by years of brutal combat. They had stormed the beaches of Dieppe in 1942, suffering catastrophic casualties in a raid that would haunt Canadian military memory forever. Of the 5,000 Canadians who landed at Dieppe, more than half became casualties. 900 never came home. The survivors carried scars, both physical and psychological, wounds that transformed them from eager volunteers into something far more dangerous. They had seen their friends torn apart by German machine guns. They had watched their comrades burn alive in disabled tanks. They had learned that war was not glory and honor but blood and screaming and death. And they remembered. Montgomery didn't understand this. He saw their rural backgrounds and assumed weakness. He noted their lack of formal military pedigree and concluded inferiority. He observed their casual discipline compared to British regulars and interpreted it as amateurism. What he failed to recognize was that these men fought differently because they thought differently. They weren't professional soldiers following orders blindly. They were citizens in uniform who understood exactly what they were fighting for and what they had already sacrificed. The Falaise operation began with a simple strategic objective. German forces were trapped in a pocket between advancing American forces from the south and Canadian-British forces from the north. The gap between these Allied pincers was narrowing, but Hitler had ordered his armies to hold position rather than retreat. This created a killing ground approximately 15 miles long and 8 miles wide, packed with the remnants of German Army Group B. An estimated 100,000 German soldiers, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, and entire SS divisions were compressed into an increasingly smaller space. The plan was straightforward. American forces would press from the south while Canadian forces, supported by Polish and British units, would drive south from Caen to seal the pocket shut. Once closed, the trapped German forces would be annihilated. Simple in concept, catastrophic in execution. Montgomery assigned the operation to 1st Canadian Army under General Harry Crerar. This was Canada's show. Their chance to prove themselves on the grand stage of Western European warfare. But Montgomery's skepticism was palpable. He placed British generals in key positions, essentially second-guessing Canadian leadership before the battle even began. His attitude filtered down through the command structure, creating an atmosphere where Canadians felt they had something to prove. They were about to prove it with unprecedented violence. August 7, 1944. Operation Totalize begins. The objective is to break through German defensive lines south of Caen and drive toward Falaise. The Canadians attack at night, a radical departure from standard doctrine. 72 converted self-propelled guns called priests, stripped of their weapons and converted into armored personnel carriers, rumble forward carrying infantry. Behind them, tanks advance in darkness guided by radio beams and tracer fire. The attack catches German defenders off guard. Canadian forces punch through defensive positions with shocking speed and brutality. Farm boys who had spent their youth handling livestock were now handling German prisoners with cold efficiency. Young men who had learned to shoot gophers on the prairie were now dropping German soldiers at 300 yards. The advance continues through the night and into the following day. But then it stalls. German SS divisions counterattack with fanatical intensity. The 12th SS Panzer Division, composed of teenage Hitler Youth members and hardened SS veterans, throws itself against Canadian positions. These weren't regular Wehrmacht soldiers. These were ideological warriors who had committed atrocities across Eastern Europe. They fought with suicidal determination, believing in Hitler's promises of superweapons and final victory. The fighting becomes savage. Villages change hands multiple times. Tank duels erupt at point-blank range. Infantry combat descends into hand-to-hand brutality. And the Canadians discover something about themselves. Something dark and powerful. They discover they are very good at killing. The 12th SS had a particular reputation. Since landing in Normandy, they had murdered Canadian prisoners of war. In multiple documented incidents, SS troops had executed surrendering Canadians, sometimes shooting them in the back of the head, sometimes running them over with tanks, sometimes simply massacring groups of prisoners. The most notorious incident occurred at the Ardennes Abbey, where SS troops murdered 20 Canadian prisoners, shooting them in pairs and leaving their bodies scattered across the grounds. Word of these atrocities spread through Canadian ranks like wildfire. The farm boys who Montgomery dismissed were transforming into something else entirely. They were becoming avengers. August 8th and 9th see brutal fighting around Tilly-la-Campagne and other Norman villages. Canadian infantry clear German positions house by house, room by room. SS troops fight from cellars and attics, turning every building into a fortress. The Canadians respond with overwhelming firepower and controlled fury. Flamethrowers incinerate defensive positions. Tank guns reduce stone buildings to rubble. Artillery pounds German lines with methodical precision. But the advance continues to grind forward slowly. Too slowly. Montgomery grows impatient. He starts making comments about Canadian capabilities, about their speed, about their aggression. These comments reach Canadian ears. The resentment builds. These men have been fighting and dying for 5 years while America sat on the sidelines. They've suffered through Dieppe, Sicily, Italy, and now Normandy. And now some British field marshal who spent most of the war planning operations from comfortable headquarters is questioning their courage. The farm boys take it personally. August 14th. Operation Tractable launches. This is the second major Canadian drive toward Falaise. This time lessons learned from Totalize are applied. Smoke screens obscure Canadian movements. Artillery bombardments are more precisely targeted. Infantry-tank cooperation is refined. And the Canadians attack with renewed ferocity. German resistance remains fierce. SS units fight with desperation, knowing that encirclement means destruction. But something has changed in the Canadian assault. The farm boys are no longer just following orders. They're hunting. Stories begin circulating through German ranks. Stories about Canadian troops showing no mercy. About SS prisoners being executed. About wounded Germans being finished off rather than treated. About entire defensive positions being wiped out without any survivors. The Canadians were learning to fight like the SS fought, and the SS didn't like it. But here's what makes this so complicated, so morally gray. Were the Canadians committing war crimes? Some historians argue yes. Others point out that they were responding to documented SS atrocities against Canadian prisoners. The truth is probably somewhere in between. War transforms men. It strips away civilization and reveals the raw capacity for violence that lurks beneath. The farm boys who had grown up learning to care for animals were now killing human beings with industrial efficiency. And they were getting better at it. August 16th. Canadian forces enter Falaise. The medieval town sits at the northern edge of the pocket. Its capture is crucial to closing the trap. German defenders fight building by building, but Canadian infantry are relentless. They've been fighting through Norman hedgerows and villages for weeks. They know every trick. They anticipate every defensive position. They move with the coordination of men who have survived together, fought together, bled together. Falaise falls. The northern jaw of the trap slams shut. Now the real killing begins. The Falaise gap is narrowing. German forces are desperately trying to escape through the shrinking corridor. Thousands of vehicles clogged narrow roads. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, all competing for space on roads designed for medieval foot traffic. From the air, Allied fighter-bombers circle like hawks. Typhoon rocket-firing aircraft sweep down on German columns, their rockets tearing through armor and flesh. American thunderbolts strafe anything that moves. The roads become rivers of blood and burning metal. But the aircraft can't do it alone. Ground forces need to close the gap completely. And that job falls primarily to the Canadians driving south and Polish forces driving north. August 17th. The gap is now only 6 miles wide. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers are trying to force their way through this corridor. SS divisions are fighting rearguard actions, trying to keep the escape route open. Canadian forces are pressing forward, trying to seal it shut. The fighting reaches a crescendo of brutality. This isn't warfare as depicted in movies. This is slaughter. Canadian artillery pounds German columns with high explosive and white phosphorus shells. The latter burns at temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees, turning human beings into screaming torches. Canadian tank gunners engage German armor at ranges where they can see the faces of enemy crews. Flamethrower teams incinerate German defensive positions, the screams of burning men echoing across Norman fields. The farm boys Montgomery dismissed are now operating with mechanical efficiency. They've learned to suppress emotion. They've learned to see German soldiers not as human beings but as targets. Because to see them as human, to acknowledge their humanity, would make this impossible. And this has to be done. August 18th and 19th. The gap is closing. German attempts to escape become increasingly desperate. SS units throw themselves against Canadian positions in suicidal attacks trying to break through. They fail. Canadian infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, mow them down with industrial precision. The fields around Falaise become carpeted with German dead. Bodies lie in heaps. Destroyed vehicles smolder. The stench of death is overwhelming. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 10,000 and 18,000 German soldiers died in the Falaise Pocket. Thousands more were wounded. 50,000 were captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had entered Normandy with over 20,000 men, escaped with roughly 300 effective combatants. Other SS divisions suffered similar casualties. And the Canadians? They had proven themselves beyond any doubt. They had closed the pocket. They had destroyed German Army Group B as an effective fighting force. They had shortened the war by months, possibly preventing hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. But at what cost? Not just the lives lost, though Canadian casualties were significant, but the cost to their souls. What does it do to a man to kill so efficiently? To become so good at destroying other human beings? The farm boys who went into Falaise came out changed. They had seen things, done things that would haunt them forever. Montgomery never apologized for his farm boys' comment. In fact, he later tried to take credit for the Canadian success at Falaise, characterizing it as a triumph of his strategic planning. Canadian commanders were furious. British historians tended to downplay Canadian contributions. American accounts often ignored them entirely. It took decades for the full story of Canadian effectiveness at Falaise to receive proper recognition. But the Germans knew. The surviving SS officers who escaped the pocket carried stories of Canadian ferocity. They warned other units about the Canadians, described them as dangerous, ruthless, unforgiving. The farm boys had become bogeymen in German mess halls. Here's what Montgomery failed to understand until it was too late. Being a farm boy wasn't a weakness. It was a source of incredible strength. These men understood hard work. They understood endurance. They understood that sometimes you have to do brutal, difficult things because they need to be done. A farmer who has spent his youth slaughtering livestock for food doesn't flinch at violence the same way a city boy might. A man who has worked 16-hour days in harvest season has endurance that can't be taught in basic training. More importantly, these men fought for something real. They weren't professional soldiers following abstract orders. They were citizens defending democracy against fascism. They had brothers and cousins and childhood friends who had died at Dieppe. They had seen German atrocities firsthand. They knew what happened to prisoners taken by the SS. And they decided, collectively and individually, that mercy was a luxury they could no longer afford. The Falaise Pocket represented a turning point not just in the war but in how Canadians saw themselves. Before Falaise, they were the junior partner in the Allied coalition. After Falaise, they were recognized as elite troops, capable of matching or exceeding British and American forces in combat effectiveness. They had earned respect through blood and steel. But respect came at a price. The psychological toll on Canadian veterans was immense. Many struggled with what they had seen and done. Post-traumatic stress, though not yet recognized as a clinical condition, affected thousands of Falaise veterans. They had nightmares about burning tanks and screaming Germans. They couldn't forget the faces of men they had killed. They carried guilt about their own survival when so many friends had died. One Canadian veteran later described the Falaise battlefield as resembling hell. Not metaphorically hell, but literally what he imagined hell would look like. Burning vehicles, charred bodies, the smell of death so thick you could taste it, the constant sound of explosions and gunfire and screaming. He said that nothing in his rural upbringing had prepared him for that level of horror. Yet they had persevered. They had done what needed to be done. They had closed the gap. They had destroyed the enemy. And they had proven Montgomery catastrophically wrong. The immediate aftermath of Falaise was chaos. Thousands of German prisoners needed to be processed. Wounded soldiers from both sides required medical care. The battlefield needed to be cleared of destroyed vehicles and weapons. And the dead needed to be buried. So many dead. Canadian units moved through the pocket systematically. They catalogued German equipment, assessed enemy casualties, gathered intelligence. What they found was staggering. Hundreds of tanks destroyed. Thousands of vehicles wrecked. Artillery pieces abandoned. Small arms scattered across fields. And bodies. Everywhere bodies. Some historians have argued that the Falaise Pocket could have been closed sooner, that the gap should never have existed at all. They blame Montgomery's cautious planning and rigid command structure. Others argue that the terrain and German resistance made faster closure impossible. The debate continues. But what cannot be debated is the effectiveness of Canadian forces once committed to battle. They performed every task assigned to them. They broke through German defensive lines. They captured Falaise. They sealed the pocket. They annihilated SS divisions. The farm boys delivered. As news of the Falaise victory spread, Canadian newspapers celebrated. Headlines proclaimed the triumph. Families of soldiers felt pride mixed with relief. Their boys were winning. They were proving themselves against the best the Germans could throw at them. Canada was emerging from Britain's shadow as a military power in its own right. But in Canadian units, the mood was more complex. Yes, they had won a great victory. Yes, they had proven themselves. But at what cost? How many friends had they buried? How many horrific sights were seared into their memories? How many would carry psychological scars for the rest of their lives? Montgomery eventually had to acknowledge Canadian effectiveness. In later reports and memoirs, he praised Canadian forces, though often in backhanded ways that suggested their success was due to British planning and support. Canadian commanders seethed at this characterization. They knew the truth. Their men had done the fighting. Their men had taken the casualties. Their men had closed the pocket. The legacy of Falaise extends far beyond World War II. It established Canada as a serious military power. It proved that citizen armies could match or exceed professional forces in combat effectiveness. It demonstrated that underestimating troops based on their background was a dangerous mistake. And it showed that ordinary men, given extraordinary circumstances, are capable of both heroism and horror. Today, the Falaise area is peaceful farmland again. Tourists visit the battlefields, walking through fields where thousands died. Monuments commemorate both Allied and German dead. The corridor of death has returned to being simply a corridor, a stretch of Norman countryside notable only for its historical significance. But the ghosts remain. The memories persist. Veterans who survived Falaise carried those memories to their graves. They rarely spoke about what they had done there. The killing was too intense, too personal, too brutal. They had become something they never imagined becoming. They had proven they could match SS troops in ferocity. And that realization was both empowering and terrifying. The farm boys Montgomery dismissed had shown him and the world what they were truly capable of. They had taken everything the German military could throw at them and not just survived but triumphed. They had closed the Falaise Pocket, destroyed German Army Group B and shortened World War II by months. They had saved countless Allied lives by ending the war sooner. But more than that, they had proven something fundamental about human nature. That ordinary people, when pushed to their limits, when defending what they believe in, when avenging fallen friends, are capable of extraordinary violence. That the capacity for both heroism and horror exists within all of us. That farm boys can become warriors and warriors can become killers and killers can still be heroes. Montgomery called them farm boys. The Germans called them devils. History calls them the liberators of Europe. But they called themselves simply Canadians doing what needed to be done. The lesson of Falaise extends beyond military history. It speaks to the danger of underestimating people based on superficial characteristics. It reminds us that strength comes in many forms. It demonstrates that motivation and determination can overcome technical disadvantages. And it proves that those closest to the land often possess qualities that urban elites fail to recognize. Those farm boys knew hard work. They knew sacrifice. They knew that some jobs, no matter how unpleasant, need to be done. They brought those lessons from Canadian fields to Norman battlefields. They applied rural work ethic to urban warfare. And they proved that Montgomery's dismissive comment was perhaps the most inaccurate assessment in his entire military career. 18,000 SS troops died in the Falaise Pocket. Many at the hands of those farm boys. Each death represented a story, a family, a life cut short. War doesn't discriminate. It kills indiscriminately, consuming soldiers from both sides. The Canadians who inflicted those casualties were themselves casualties of a different sort. They lost innocence. They lost naivety. They lost the comfortable belief that they were fundamentally different from their enemies. Because in the end, they learned they could kill just as efficiently as the SS. They could be just as brutal, just as unforgiving, just as relentless. The only difference was whose side they fought on. And that's a sobering, uncomfortable truth that many Falaise veterans carried with them for the rest of their lives. But they did what needed to be done. They closed the gap. They won the battle. They helped end the war. And they earned respect not through Montgomery's approval but despite his dismissal. The farm boys had become soldiers. The soldiers had become warriors. And the warriors had become legends. Today, when military historians discuss effective fighting forces in World War II, they mention elite units like the British Special Air Service, American Rangers, German paratroopers, and Soviet Guards divisions. And increasingly they mention Canadian forces. They mention Dieppe. They mention Juno Beach. They mention Ortona. And they mention Falaise. Especially Falaise. Because Falaise represented not just a military victory but a transformation. It was where farm boys proved they were warriors. Where colonials proved they were equal to any fighting force on earth. Where Montgomery's prejudices were shattered by Canadian performance. The next time someone dismisses you based on your background, remember the Canadian farm boys at Falaise. Remember that underestimation can be a powerful motivator. Remember that proving people wrong is one of life's great satisfactions. And remember that your origins don't define your capabilities. Those farm boys went on to help liberate the Netherlands, where Dutch families still honor Canadian graves with flowers. They went on to cross the Rhine to push into Germany itself. They went on to become occupation forces, then peacekeeping forces, then veterans who built modern Canada. They took the lessons learned in Norman fields and applied them to building a nation. And they never forgot Falaise. How could they? It was where they proved themselves. Where they showed the world what Canadians could do. Where farm boys became killers and killers became heroes and heroes became legends. Montgomery died in 1976, having written extensively about his military career. He never fully acknowledged how wrong he had been about the Canadians. He maintained his belief in British military superiority even as evidence mounted that Allied victory required contributions from all partners. History has not been kind to his prejudices. But history has been very kind to those Canadian farm boys. They are remembered. They are honored. They are celebrated as the heroes they were. Their story is taught in Canadian schools. Their graves are tended in Norman cemeteries. Their sacrifice is commemorated every year. Because they earned it. Through blood and sacrifice and courage. Through determination and skill and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Through proving everyone wrong whoever doubted them. 18,000 SS troops learned the hard way that farm boys can fight. Montgomery learned it too, though he never admitted it. The world learned it. And perhaps most importantly, Canada learned it about itself. This is a story that needs to be remembered. A story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. A story of prejudice overcome by performance. A story of heroes who never considered themselves heroic, just men doing their duty. A story of farm boys who massacred the SS at Falaise Pocket. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the hidden depths in ordinary people, if it reminded you never to underestimate someone based on their background, then do two things. First, subscribe to this channel because there are countless more untold stories of World War II that deserve to be heard. Stories of heroes forgotten by history. Stories of battles that changed the world. Stories that need telling. Second, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Do you have family members who fought at Falaise? Do you know other stories of underestimated warriors? Do you think the Canadians were justified in their actions against the SS? Let's discuss this in the comments. Let's honor these veterans by keeping their memory alive. because that's what they deserve. Not to be dismissed as farm boys, but to be remembered as the warriors who proved everyone wrong. The men who closed the Falaise Pocket. The heroes who helped win World War II. Never forget them. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never assume that rural backgrounds mean military inadequacy. And never, ever call Canadian soldiers farm boys unless you want them to prove you catastrophically wrong. Subscribe. Comment. Remember. That's all they ask.